Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Adam Berger. I am the Chief Information Security Officer with Netrix Global, in addition to being our VP of Managed Services Security Services at Netrix. Really excited today to be hosting a security roundtable on the topic of zero-day attacks and how they are exposing both weak and mature security programs. We had a recent statistic published that 61% of the vulnerabilities are being exploited within 2 days. And so really the reality of that is, your average security program really just cannot keep up with that. It's a very large threat, and companies are grappling to stay in front of these zero-day attacks. And for that reason, we actually gathered a diverse group of SMEs here to talk to you today about how you can get in front of these threats, what are some of the strategies that you can deploy to help mitigate zero-day vulnerabilities, and how you can implement some things into your security program to help address zero-day threats. And so I'm going to go ahead and introduce our speakers. First, we have Elaine Cochums. She's a vCISO in our team at Netrix Global. She has almost 2 decades of experience as a virtual Chief Information Security Officer. She helps clients build out mature, robust security programs, develop asset management programs, design vulnerability management strategies, and manage incident response efforts, including ransomware recovery. So she'll be able to round out our house here a little bit, talking about governance and how people are defining security strategies to help address zero-day threats. Second, I'm also delighted to introduce Alex Shi. He's our offensive security team lead here at Netrix Global. 15 years of industry experience in offensive security and specializing in offensive security projects for clients, pen testing, purple team engagements, security assessments. And Alex, for as far as our discussion today, is really going to bring forward some good conversation around how offensive security, security assessments, and other things in the offensive security space can help you get in front of zero-day attacks. And last, but certainly not least, we have Rich Lilly with us here. He's a technologist here and a field CTO at Netrix for security. Rich brings to the table over 25 years of consulting experience, and he's a leading SME in Microsoft security, compliance, and identity. Rich brings a wealth of experience when it comes to technology and how clients are able to use some of the great technology that's out there to help identify, prevent, detect, and respond to zero-day attacks. And with that, prior for us getting into this discussion, this is going to be a roundtable discussion. We're going to try to keep it pretty organic and kind of talk about different strategies. Before we get into full discussion, I'm going to go ahead and kick it over to Alex. Alex has a pretty cool presentation to us demonstrating a zero-day attack and how relevant it is and how real these threats are in our environment today.
Thanks, Adam. So today what we're going to look at are 2 different exploits against a Palo Alto device. The idea here is really to demonstrate how quickly vulnerabilities can be exploited once they are disclosed. For these 2 CVEs in particular, they're related to the Palo Alto device not handling authentication properly, as well as session management. So we'll take a look shortly here. And for those of you who are quick with your phones, look out for the QR code with more details on the specific vulnerability itself.
Awesome. Thanks for that, Alex. So Alex, maybe you could talk us through a little bit the reality of a threat like that as it relates to how fast we're able to exploit an environment.
For sure. So this stuff happens very quickly. The information is either shared on social media or specific feeds from security researchers out there. These vulnerabilities typically do get disclosed to the particular vendor, giving them some time to kind of give a response or remediation to it. Sometimes it doesn't always happen, and then you have the proof of concept that gets released out in the net. I think one of the more concerning things in today's age of automation is that this stuff can snowball very quickly. When you have an exploit like the one that was just demoed, it's very easy to set up a script that can scrape the net for these types of devices. And if you see the behavior starting to happen out in the net, you can then move to the point of exploitation.
Awesome. Yeah, thanks for a little bit of background there. I'll go ahead and hop over to Rich here in the discussion. We kind of saw there how fast someone is able to weaponize and get into a firewall. Rich, what are you seeing out there as far as clients go and these exploits being leveraged very quickly?
I mean, we see these all the time, right? I mean, I think the other challenge is with a lot of the modern LLMs that exist out there, crafting very unique attacks, leveraging some commonly and easily available information is way easier than ever has been before. So, I think that time from, as Alex said, POC to true weaponization is decreased a lot because of, a lot of the availability of some of these tools. And again, platforms like ChatGPT and others that can be used to build them a lot quicker has been pretty interesting. So, definitely need to be taken more seriously. And, a lot of these 0 days become reality very quickly.
Totally agree. Definitely a situation where, one strategy is not going to tackle the problem, right? So what I really enjoy the fact that we have the three of you here is layered defense, right? So we're going to get into that topic here. Really, there's obviously your traditional vulnerability scanning. There's obviously tooling that can get in front of trying to detect these things. We're going to cover those. But, you do have to have multiple layers of your security stack down to be able to combat the threats. Think about what are the multiple layers. And so, inclination is to hop directly into technology and look at, okay, how can we know these things are out there and then prevent them or patch them, detect them, address them. But actually, one of the reasons that we have Elaine here is to talk about governance, right? So if we look at a little bit of a foundational element behind how are you running your programs, do you have the right commitment? Do you have the right people in place to be looking at your programs? And so I want to kick this discussion over, starting with governance, actually, to Elaine, and just to talk a little bit about how effective security governance helps this model in terms of layered defense, and when it comes to be able to have a good program in place to look at 0 days and how to address those within your company.
Thank you, Adam. And you're so right. So often people want to jump into the sexy technology because what Alex and team do is fun. And people are like, hey, governance is just this extra cost center. It doesn't get us anything. It's just people writing policy and documentation. We don't really care what's in a Word document somewhere. And that's wrong. So when I'm helping clients, one of the first things we tend to see with immature security posture is that people haven't thought about their governance program. But governance helps establish clear roles and responsibilities so you know who's supposed to be doing what. So when it comes to that vulnerability patching, you know who is supposed to be patching the servers versus who might be patching the workstations. It also helps prioritize resource allocation because part of governance is risk. And so you understand where your data is going to be, you understand how you have classified your data, and you understand where you need to protect it the most. Because again, we're going back to layered defenses and we're going back to finite budgets. Nobody can spend to protect everything. It also enforces proactive risk management. So you have to use continuous threat intelligence and vulnerability assessments to try and figure out where those threat actors are going to come in at, where you are your weakest, and how you can shore those areas up. It also tends to facilitate adaptive policies and training. So you're constantly making sure your policies are current. So we saw with COVID, a lot of people were suddenly sent home and were suddenly working remote. That required a massive change in how people delivered services, but it also delivered a change in how people did security and what policies were appropriate and what weren't when people suddenly moved from offices to, living rooms, basements, wherever. And then finally, it helps enable rapid incident response. By building on the roles and responsibilities in current plans and regular testing, all of that comes together so that you can more effectively identify and contain and recover if a 0-day exploit does occur in your environment.
Awesome, yeah. Appreciate that, Elaine. Kind of question within what you said there, Elaine. You talked a little bit about risk management and effective prioritization, and so with so many vulnerabilities that are out there, as far as different types of attacks, different types of devices that people have, and the types of CVEs that get published. How do you effectively prioritize when it comes to governance and a risk management strategy in a company?
So effective prioritization is going to be looking at a combination of what are your threats and what is the potential impact of those threats, and sort of looking at it across and figuring out where you're most likely to have an impact and how high that impact's going to be. And so you take that and then you put together your risk assessment and then go from there in terms of identifying what are your crown jewels. And crown jewels is not only data, it's your systems. You know, if email is critical to you, then you have to be able to make sure you understand where your email data stays and all of your mailboxes are, but you also need to understand how that's protected and what servers and what equipment is on there.
Awesome. Yeah. Now, that to me highlights asset inventory, Elaine, just from what you're saying,
Yes.
which I know in the security space is a loved topic. So, you know, yeah, you obviously good governance helps you have a solid program in place for addressing these, but kind of hand in hand is an asset inventory, which you're kind of alluding to in what you said there. So what do you see as far as an effective asset inventory? Like, how does that actually help a vulnerability management program and looking at zero-day threats and prioritization?
So it's going to improve your visibility of your attack surfaces. If you don't know what you have, you can't protect it. And it's really scary when you have someone come run an external pen test and they're saying, we see cameras, and you're like saying, we don't have cameras. Why are you finding them? You know, maybe somebody, you know, and then you get into the topic of shadow IT. So having an effective an effective asset inventory helps you by identifying what is everything that's in scope for you. What should you be paying attention to? What should you be managing? It also tells you what is authorized, so that if you do run a scan on your network and there's a weird access point showing up, you know whether it's yours or whether you need to investigate because it's either bleed over from another suite if you're in an office, or maybe it's an attacker. So that helps with that. It also is a place where you're going to track what is critical and how you've prioritized your assets. Again, you need to know what you have, then you need to prioritize it. And it also accelerates patching and any mitigation. So you're having regular scans, but understanding what you should be scanning and what you should be patching and what your regular cadence should be for each of those types of equipment is critical.
When you come in, Elaine, to a client environment, is laying down effective governance and a strong asset inventory, would you call those precursors to vulnerability management as far as putting that effective strategy in place? You know, they kind of go hand in hand? How do you feel about making sure those things are tidied up before maybe just hopping into vulnerability scans, as an example?
So for me, it's if you come into an incredibly immature environment, I'm going to do a combination of things. I'm going to want to know and start working on that asset inventory so we know what's in scope. I'm going to still want to start running scans on what the company thinks is in scope so we can start worrying about and fixing any critical vulnerabilities that might be out there on the stuff they know about. And then I'm also going to be working in conjunction with them to start putting in together whatever policy framework, whatever governance framework is there. Because as we find those assets and as we find those vulnerabilities, we're going to have to put them in a risk register and understand what the risks are that are facing the company.
Makes sense. So a little bit of continuous improvement model, right? So like, let's work on getting the foundational steps in, but also keep the scans going, try to address what we can, but use the governance and your asset inventory and some of that prioritization to help flesh that program out a little bit.
Yes.
Makes sense. Cool. So looking within vulnerability scanning a little bit, we talked about that. You know, I think everybody is very familiar with traditional vulnerability scanning technologies. You know, you have your Nessus, your Qualys, your Tenable's, a lot of different tooling out there. And there's great tools to identify what vulnerabilities out there. You know, kind of an emerging trend in the industry is exposure management, right? So we're looking at a little less about your day-to-day daily scans and more your overall threat posture in the environment. What does your exposure landscape look and kind of a wider lens. And so I'd love to kick that over to Rich here in the discussion to just talk to us a little bit about the concept of exposure management, how it's maybe slightly more encompassing than a traditional vulnerability management strategy, and why would companies want to look at this, and what is the industry moving to on this front?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting. You know, traditional vulnerability management, in my opinion, it's not as sufficient as it used to be at one point. I think that vulnerability management is good for points in time. You know, it doesn't cover a lot of things, and you know, depending on when that scan is done versus 0 days are released, et cetera, doesn't really always cover everything that needs to be covered, in my experience. I think also it's not very realistic to patch every potential weakness that exists out there. A lot of what we've seen for the past 10 or 15 years is kind of this large game of whack-a-mole where you're going through and whacking, you know, the ones that have the highest CVSS score. You know, to Elaine's point, when you start talking about prioritization and having an asset inventory and a risk register is, not only understanding what that threat is, but how it applies to your environment, not just because it's a highly ranked CVSS, that I need to go remediate that. If it's affecting a dev server sitting in the middle of Antarctica where there's one user, it doesn't mean I necessarily have to classify that as a high risk. It should still address it, but doesn't mean it's a high risk for me as an organization. And I think, as Elaine kind of highlighted as well, looking at things that are important to your business is important to classify some of these things. Is email a critical service? Is having OneDrive or SharePoint a critical service? Is having a specific web app or a SaaS app up a critical service? These things are all going to be deterministic based on your business and who you are and what you do, and it's probably not going to be the same for every organization that's out there. I think that what we've seen with vendors like Microsoft and CrowdStrike kind of recently entering this exposure management market is a much larger focus in this concept of proactive defense, where, again, vulnerability management is more looked at kind of that whack-a-mole game. This is actually looking at things similar to what Elaine said as well. What are my crown jewels? What are the quickest hops and steps to get there? How do I make sure those are protected and help me prioritize what I need to address versus just kind of going through and picking what is the right item on the list to go out and remediate. So again, I think that the kind of landscape is modernizing right now, and we're seeing some vendors take some pretty unique approaches to this as well right now.
Within Microsoft CrowdStrike, you mentioned those, Rich. Let's talk about Microsoft for a second, just as an example. What kind of, when you talk about exposure management, right? So we know about traditional vulnerability scanning, and that's kind of a point and touch tool. You give IP ranges and you set them to scan. What kind of telemetry does a Microsoft or CrowdStrike bring into an exposure management offering, and kind of how do they do that effectively, right? So we're talking about more than just external posture. We're talking about, within your enterprise, your endpoints and other areas. So how does that telemetry get in there, and how does that help a vulnerability management strategy when we're talking about zero-day attacks?
Yeah, I mean, I can speak mostly on the Microsoft side. I mean, I think the interesting thing is we've kind of taken this concept of what is XDR, which we'll talk about in a little bit here, but that kind of applies to the threat and vulnerability side as well, and kind of proactive defense. So one thing that, for instance, Microsoft has done really well with their exposure management solution is they've stitched together assets from every single service they have into one, unified superhighway of vulnerability information. So whether that asset exists in Azure, whether that asset exists on premises, whether it's an endpoint, an identity, even an IoT device, et cetera, their exposure management focus is on bringing these all together with an easy correlatable system, and then allowing you to kind of stack rank what's important to you into one place. And I think that's made it a lot easier to consume versus just trying to, look at 10, 12 different places from different solutions and different vendors. They've done a really good job of bringing that all into one interface, even with some third-party vendors as well.
Cool. How do, when we're looking at this technology, I know a lot of these areas have built-in threat intelligence, right? So when we talk about what some of these vendors can bring to the table when you're implementing some of this broader tooling. And so how do we leverage threat intelligence when we talk about zero-day attacks, as far as it being in the tooling and for prioritizing vulnerabilities that may be potentially exploited by a zero-day attack? Rich?
Yeah, I think a lot of this, depends on the quality. I think, Alex and I were kind of talking back and forth at the beginning of the session today that, when things are still in kind of the POC phases, or they're, just posted to X or on this forum or this dark website, et cetera, we don't necessarily have all of the right information at that point to be able to develop, either an IOC or IOA. And in many cases, we need that to build a rule, to build a host or a domain or an IP address. These things aren't consistent enough to be able to be built into indicators just yet. In many cases, some vendors offer some level of threat intelligence kind of right out of the box. That's never really enough, in my opinion. There are some amazing sources out there of both free and paid threat intelligence. And the key point here is to look for quality. Certainly, you can go out and buy some of the many threat intelligence providers that I won't name today. There are some free sources out there as well. So even if you're an organization that is not ready to go out and pay for, some of these solutions, there are plenty of them like, Anomaly Limo and IBM Threat Exchange and others that are freely open to the public. Certainly, they have paid examples as well. But these can be good to get kind of early indicators that are, kind of on the edge of being released as these threats are being developed. I think the other thing you have to realize is that, if I have an EDR, an XDR, an MDR platform, it's going to take the vendors some time to develop, some of these. So where threat intelligence can help fill the gap is helping, identify and commit some of these IOCs or IOs early on as well. And again, these can be, good ways to supplement an already, built XDR and other platform, and definitely shouldn't just be, sourced from first party in my opinion.
Makes sense. Yeah, I mean, I think it lends to the layered defense discussion, Rich, as far as just being a component in your stack, having the threat intel, see if you can get any emerging tips that are out there. But on its own, it may not stand as a strategy, is what you're highlighting, Rich, and having a part of a comprehensive suite within something like exposure management can definitely help.
And I think one last fun fact too, I mean, depending what industry you're in, you may want to reach out to your local ISAC chapter, or your industry cybersecurity chapter, because you'll also find that there are like kind of committees or groups that will develop industry specific threat intelligence and distribute that even freely amongst, partner and even competitor companies in many cases as well.
That's a good call, Rich. I want to move over. So we talked a little bit here about governance, how that, laying down a defensive strategy as it relates to your overall program and prioritizing risk, a little bit on VulScan exposure management. I want to take advantage of Alex being here and looking at offensive security and how, we're kind of in this realm of identifying our threats, right? So Alex, how do, things like security assessments, pen testing, and some of the things you can do with offensive security help when it comes to like a zero-day attack strategy and being aware of these threats and how to respond to them?
Yeah, in regards to pen testing itself, it's a very good way to get a practical kick the tires approach when looking at your security program, right? So you've got individuals who are emulating threat actor activity. They're looking at the environment, identifying the vulnerabilities that do exist, and then seeing what's exploitable. Not all exploits are created equal. From an offensive security engagement standpoint, there's different value in me getting access to a building control system versus the core identity provider. Depending on what my goals are as a threat actor, I'm going to target one or the other. If I'm trying to be disruptive versus privilege escalate. In general, I think pen testing really helps to prioritize in a security program. So Elaine mentioned that earlier. The scope of vulnerabilities can be overwhelming for a lot of organizations. It gets worse the bigger you get. So how do you identify what do we have to focus on today, next week, this quarter? Pen testing will identify the path of least resistance, within a current organization's footprint, and identify and prioritize what needs to get taken care of right away versus what can we roadmap, push further out, later down the line. In some circumstances with some of these exploits, there are vendors out there that have indicated for legacy devices, especially, they're not going to be patched, right? And we do run into scenarios where we find these endpoints are vulnerable. We talk with our clients about this stuff, and it ends up being an issue with their hardware upgrade lifecycle or their patching program, right? They just got too busy with the business. They weren't able to get their hands around keeping these devices either updated or upgraded. And then you've got, security holes as a result.
Makes sense. Yeah. When you look at zero-day attacks, we are worried about the things that are emerging quickly. But to your point, there are things out on the internet that a lot of people may not have been able to remediate effectively, and those become low-hanging fruit for attacking. And so from what I'm hearing from you, Alex, when you get into offensive security, when it comes to helping companies address this, just exposing the fact that there are some of those easy ways to get in, whether they be vulnerable to what could be exploited on a newly emerging exploit or old, helps company takes a little bit of a fresh lens, I guess, of like, okay, yeah, like this could have been popped very quickly, and maybe prioritize their devices a little more effectively for that least path. That's what I'm hearing you highlight here, Alex.
Yeah, absolutely.
Makes sense. When you look at like internal security assessments, Alex, or just overall security posture assessments, we talked a little bit about like offensive security and like the active testing, but when you come to like a posture assessment, sounds like it's part of that strategy from what you're highlighting, right? So that could be maybe doing like a cloud assessment or a specific segmented assessment. Is that kind of built into what you're talking about as far as like just looking at really where your weak points are and how to address those, or to think about, maybe putting compensated controls in place?
Yeah, scoping is absolutely really important. When you're looking at a certain program, when you're evaluating the posture of a certain organization's security, whether that be out in the cloud or through governance processes, it is really important to understand, okay, what are the supporting procedures to reinforce security? Let's take cloud as an example. If the organization is a little bit delayed in making sure that they're doing security testing and hardening configs in the environment over time, you know, when you're looking at the posture of that program, gaps will eventually appear, right? And maybe that's not an issue of the technologies that are in place, but more of, okay, what are the supporting processes behind that? You know, is the organization thinking about security? Are they rolling that into their development life cycles to make sure that it's baked in and not strapped on?
Makes sense. I want to kick it over to Elaine on the heels of like an offensive to security discussion, coming back to like prioritizing what's in your program and having a good vuln practice as it relates to being able to address what's seen, maybe unknown in the case of 0 days. Have you seen scenarios where an offensive security test came through and made you sort of re-look at, or a company that you were working with re-look at the vulnerability management program, how it's being remediated and how things are being prioritized, because the findings were so like, aha? I'm kind of interested to hear like the kind of connect to what Alex was saying.
So I think we have seen, I love getting pen testers in and doing these kinds of assessments with clients, because we always find things we don't expect. Generally, there's usually a pretty good sense of how mature or immature an organization is with their asset management, with their vulnerability management. So you have a clue of what's going on. But everyone, you know, there's still that moment of shock and surprise when, you know, the pen tester calls you up and says, hey, do you know you have a 2012 SQL server sitting out there? And it looks like it might have some financial data on it. And there's that heart-stopping moment of what the heck? So absolutely, there are certainly times that, you know, that changes sort of your position of what is the highest risk, because you didn't know something was out there. More often it's confirming, and it's giving the technical evidence for what people think or feel is happening in their environment. You know, you walk into an organization, you talk to a couple of people, eventually someone's going to say, yeah, we just kind of throw things out. We don't have a good change management process. So sort of to Alex's point about cloud configuration changes, and you can start out with a system that is well designed and set up, but if you're not sort of tracking those things, your vulnerabilities start become much greater, because lots of things can get changed and there isn't a clear idea of why something is being changed. And so you go from, Microsoft is set up, we're great, we're in the cloud, it's all secure. And then you realize that you had an engineer in there toggling some switches and they turned off conditional access on certain things. Whoops, that's a huge issue. So again, yes, we love the external pen testers coming in, doing those assessments, internal and external cloud, all of those different kinds, because we always get very technical, solid, actionable work. Generally it's confirming, but every once in a while it gives us something that, gives us something else to stay up late at night worrying about until we get it fixed, and might move something higher up on a priority or risk matrix.
Makes sense. Yeah, I like, when you're talking about information security leadership and sort of being in a position to help the business prioritize, that can be a difficult role, right? A lot of times you see things and you have a program in place, but maybe the funding's not there, or the business priority is a little bit of strain because of circumstances, and you need to sort of figure out what you can and can't do. And, from Alex, you definitely highlighting the concept of, hey, through an offensive security test, you do get that little bit of the wake up moment. And then Elaine, leveraging those wake up moments to then raise some business awareness, bring that back into your program a little bit and get sort of that refresh look. Part of that layered defense model is that continuous improvement, which we talked about a little bit too. So, offensive security helping that, and then having that synergy between your governance and bringing it back into your risk program, and then prioritizing your vulnerabilities or other things that were identified. Definitely a really good way for security management people who are just kind of, in some cases, I don't want to say fighting to keep up, but trying to prioritize effectively with the business. You can use these tools to help make sure you have these good strategy items in place to help address vulnerabilities. So that's great call out. Great. So we kind of covered a lot of stuff here around governance, identification of threats, right? So obviously, when you talk about vulnerability management, ensuring you have a program in place when it comes to your governance, your risk management strategy, identification of threats, and then how you're prioritizing those. It's a big piece. When we're talking about layered defense for zero-day attack strategy, these are foundational elements, right? So even if you can't see a zero-day attack is coming because you don't know it's out there, having these elements in place help you have a well-oiled program and the ability to continually improve that, which is a big piece of this layered defense model we're talking about. I want to now transition a little bit to the other side of things, a little more on like protection, detection, and responding to threats, right? So we talked about that front end of that, your meteor part of your security program, and be able to identify. Let's talk a little bit about protection and a little bit on detection. So Rich, you had mentioned EDR tooling before, and I just wanted to talk about EDR and how things like next-gen firewalls, AI, some of the EDR tooling that's out there, centralized logging. How do we see that when it comes to vulnerability strategies, zero-day attack strategies in particular come into concern because they're emerging threats? We talked about threat intel. So maybe you can round us out a little bit when it comes to this type of tooling, Rich, and how you see that being part of a layered defense model when it comes to just getting in front of zero-day attacks and the pending vulnerabilities that we may not know about.
Yeah, sure thing. I think there's been, we've all seen this shift towards more of XDR, right? So I think a lot of the major vendor platforms have adopted this strategy in the last year or two here, probably more real than ever before. Again, XDR being the concept of being able to commit specific assets and different tools and different systems to each other very easily and in an automated type fashion. My opinion, that helps kind of build a clear attack story. Most of these have been really focused in on things like identity and email and cloud SaaS and endpoint. I think what we're starting to see more is kind of expanding the EDR and MDR into other highly valuable and reliable signal. I think all those words are important in my opinion. You're really only adding value if it's high value signal. I think that looking at a lot of low fidelity signals, it's not going to provide a lot of context or reasoning, doesn't really help. And certainly things like having firewall logs or to an extent, or having your SaaS app vendors security signal generating security logs and information, having kind of the more signal is always better. In the modern world, that tends to mean more cost as well. But a lot of the vendors and solutions offer ways to help control the cost and store just the meaningful information and get out some of the information that may not be as important, like all the accepted connections. Do I really need to store every accepted connection for the last 1 year? No, and that's going to be a lot of them. I think the other thing that we're seeing as well is that that strategy of store everything always forever isn't really always the right approach. That tends to be, as I said, in the modern world, expensive, and the value of that signal kind of diminishes over time. Although it can be good for things like forensics. So there may be value in maybe putting it out into secondary or tertiary storage. Again, we look at the type of information that's coming in, the value to the organization. Back to, I think, what all of us have kind of said at different points throughout today is there are going to be different things that are meaningful to different businesses. So again, kind of understanding what that means and what that app importance is to your business and your function is going to be important as well. I'm always a big proponent of perimeter and SASE and other type of like logs because they're good early indicators. Just looking at Alex's demo that he showed us at the very start of today's video, it's interesting because we may be seeing some of those events by just hitting the perimeter before it actually becomes a zero day or an exploit, or there may be some discovery campaigns or other things happening. So all in all, I'm all in on having more signal and bringing into XDR things like firewalls and perimeter and other types of information into a central log aggregator is important in today's world because it needs to provide a much larger and comprehensive picture.
Makes sense. Yeah, looking at like EDR, XDR, next gen, I think there's a big piece there of anomaly detection, behavioral analysis on what's happening, right? So when we talk about unknown 0 days, while they may not be known through either threat intelligence or some of the emerging things that are happening in the environment, some of those tools will be able to detect that, Rich, right? And say, hey, look, don't know what this is, but it looks like an attack technique based on like MITRE or one of these other attack verticals, and actually get visibility to that. Kind of interested, like Elaine, you having worked with a lot of clients, have you seen scenarios with like EDR tooling or next-gen firewalls where there's something going on. It may be related to a zero-day vulnerability, but the team was able to get in front of that or got better visibility to it using these tools in their environment?
Absolutely. I think first I'm going to go back and harp on asset management though for a minute. If you if you see something in the news that says, Checkpoint had a huge breach, or we have a 0 day coming out against, pick a company. The first thing you need to know is, do you have any of those, whatever they are, in your environment? And then that allows you to start working with your SOC and figuring out those indicators of compromise and those sorts of things based on the limited information that's out there. And sort of to both your point and to Rich's point, you can see on the perimeter what's happening. You can see things that are anomalous. And so that can also help you quickly sort of say, hey, what should I be looking at? With all of these tools, signal to noise ratio is really important. And people who understand what is normal for your environment. I came out of the defense world where, if the board is all green, there's something wrong because you're missing it. In other places, if the board is all green, we're good. We're not missing anything. So it really depends on your industry. It really depends on what your company risk profile is. And it requires your SOC to understand what's normal for you. Because if your SOC is understanding, if that analyst that's looking at those alerts on a regular basis or is seeing any triggers about anomalous behavior, they're like, oh, it's Tuesday. We always have this weird service run on Tuesday. If it's something like, hey, wait, I've never seen this before, and they're going to jump in, engage quickly, that's where they're going to stop that behavior and prevent something bad from happening sooner rather than later.
That makes sense. I love the connection that you guys are making around layer defense when it comes to deploying your tooling effectively, monitoring it, and then having your security program actually weigh in, make sure that things are tuned properly, making sure that you're able to prioritize. And then if you have some monitoring stuff in place, like MDR services, or you have an internal SOC, making sure that they're aware of what is normal, what is not, right? I mean, I think the signal to noise ratio is a concern, and the telemetry is only sometimes as good as it's configured, right? So while the protection tools help, out of the gate, you're going to get some really good protection. It does have to be tuned, and your teams have to be looking at what's happening in the environment and then getting that feedback back to the teams managing those tools or responding to those tools. And so it does talk again about that continuous improvement, making sure there's some harmony between your tooling and what your security program is thinking it needs to prioritize for the company. Wanted to talk to Alex a little bit here on this front as well. Alex, you get into environments all day long. That's your role. So when we talk about like either EDR tools or like next-gen firewalls or machine learning, AI, when it comes to detecting threats in an environment, when you're in an environment or you've gotten into an environment or you're attempting an environment, how does this tooling prevent you from getting in, or maybe make your job harder, Alex, when it comes to your offensive security engagements?
Yeah, in terms of when we're running up against environments, running various attacks, I would say over the past couple of years, one of the things that has been the most disruptive and annoying for us when we emulate attackers is automation. So in more mature environments, when we're running up against the environment, we're running attacks, there have been scenarios where there is an automated response to the alerts that we generate. And we either see that the attacking host is quarantined, or the attacking account is quarantined, or the service account is quarantined. Those things are really effective in stopping an attacker dead in their tracks, especially when they're leveraging something like a 0 day. You get past that first line of defense without much trouble, right? You're in the internal environment, you've done some level of privilege escalation, and then you want to abuse that. In the example of service account quarantining, you get to that level of privilege, and then all of a sudden, you're locked up, essentially. So in more mature environments, we do see that automation that can help the defensive controls get a response from the time the alert is generated, because that time from when the alert actually fires and then for the organization to respond is very important. There are attackers out there who have full-on automations from those 2 points in the attack chain, right? And if you're not responding quickly and effectively, the attacker can just get further and further and further within the environment. So the automated response, I think, is definitely something we've seen over the past couple of years that has been tremendously effective for defensive controls.
Yeah, makes sense, Alex. When you look at how much time somebody's in your environment, every minute that goes by, if they're in there, is where more damage is happening, or they're able to spread out and put advanced persistent threats in, or the ability to get command and control established in a more firm way. And so it does highlight what you're saying in terms of how this tooling can really be effective, even if it's unknown, like if there's a zero-day attack happening. The reality is when that attack does happen, if they're leveraging an exploit from a zero-day vulnerability, they're in your environment, right? So being able to detect that quickly to prevent that damage is paramount when it comes to responding to some of these threats.
If I can interject here.
Yeah, please, Elaine.
Alex and I were talking the other day about a Purple Team event that his team was running. And what a Purple Team event is basically where you're sort of running an incident response tabletop and you're running a pen test at the same time. And so you have Red Team and Blue Team sort of working at the same time, and you can exchange information. And one of the things that was really interesting and useful, I think, that we learned out of that kind of an engagement is that you can help better tune what you're seeing. So the attackers or the pen testers get to say, hey, we just launched this exploit. And the blue team can say, okay, we just saw this show up in our EDR system. And so it was really good to see sort of the delays and correlations and what happened when. And so that's a really good synergy to try and incorporate with these sort of assessments and EDR solutions and all of that, is to bring it together and really be able to look at both sides and see how it connects and where it connects, so you have a better sense of where your gaps might be and what your systems may or may not pick up. That's all.
Makes sense. Elaine, it's a great highlight. What I think you're really getting into there is your incident response plans and how you're handling these events, right? So it's one thing to have the telemetry in place. It's one thing to be able to prioritize, remediations, but actually effectively responding and taking the measured response that's going to result in the either preventing further damage or actually hopefully getting in front of it in time before anything happens. And so yeah, let's hop right into response. Actually, I think that's a great area to highlight, Elaine, that you're bringing up. And so when we look at just the idea of incident response plans, when it comes to either a zero-day exploit or other vulnerabilities, do we think companies should have a specific strategy around zero-day exploits or an unknown emerging threat into their incident response plans, or should they be looking at just their general incident responsiveness and how that would come up in an event and maybe incorporating that into a broader strategy?
So I don't think you need to have a specific call out in a plan somewhere that says, if there's a 0-day, do X. What I do think is useful is having that conversation and making sure you have a plan and an understanding of what you do and how you would address things when you do hear through threat intelligence about a 0-day. So you're not going to be able to write the solution of what needs to be in, 0-day, do X. But having that in there, we monitor threat intelligence. We consider what we're going to be doing. When we see something anomalous that we don't know what makes sense, these are the next steps we take. Those are good things to include in your incident response plan. You don't know what you don't know. But if you can at least say, hey, we're seeing something, we don't know what it is, here are the next steps for that, then yes. So you're not going to have the solution of how to address every 0-day. But you can say, we've talked about it. We've thought about what happens. So much of an incident response plan is not necessarily that you're going to have a manual and you're going to whip it out and turn to page 32 and say, this happened. Okay, step 1, do this. What's really going to happen is, in the heat of the moment, is you've practiced and you have a plan and you know what should happen. And so maybe you do, if you're really mature, you pop open your incident response plan and you do turn to page 32. Most of the cases, it's all hands on deck. Everybody's sort of jumping in. Hey, we did this. Okay, I did this. Managing those communications, understanding what's happening, having someone sit back and take notes about what's happening during the incident and chime in and say, okay, has anyone thought about this? That's where your incident response plan is helpful. It's that ticker box of, hey, are we forgetting something? Did we check, east-west traffic in our, in the data center? Those sorts of things. And so it is important to have talked about 0 days and how to handle them. It's not necessary to have a step 1 through 10 of what you're going to do exactly. Does that make sense?
Absolutely makes sense. Yeah, I think the concept of a 0-day attack is an unknown threat, right? So if you have a pretty mature plan rolled out where you have a few different scenarios in there, which you've highlighted, Elaine, and how to handle those and have that rehearsed, that's what you're highlighting and focusing on here, right? In terms of just, we can't predict everything, so let's make sure we have a few variations of our plan and the ability to rehearse that and make sure that we have all the things in place. You also brought up actually right on the earlier comment you had made about purple teams and how that really does help the robustness of an incident response plan as it relates to preparedness. So I do want to kick that over to Alex a little bit, just to talk a little bit about purple team engagements. You do those a lot when it comes to your offensive security practices. How do you see that when it comes to an incident response plan, and the ability for companies to incorporate that into their overall strategy?
Yeah, for purple team engagements, they're actually my favorite to run right now. I think they're tremendously rewarding in terms of working with teams on the other side and helping them educate, what it looks like to have an active threat within the environment. In terms of the engagement itself, you want to scope the engagement so you're covering all the components of the attack chain. And the end goal really is to develop what Elaine was alluding to, which is that muscle memory of how do you respond when there is an active threat and time is very limited, right? I see this as a lot like competitive martial arts or like MMA, right? You've got to do the rehearsing, the blocking and the tackling and understanding how to react, when somebody is going after you, right? And so the purple team engagements that we run, we obviously scope them according to client needs, but we make sure to check every component of the attack chain so that, as we move through the environment, we are rerunning attacks and we're seeing how those alerts triage and show up in the client's dashboards. And where needed, we can work through that replay to help the analysts understand, okay, what is an alert that needs to be actionable versus, okay, this is normal traffic that we don't need to investigate. Sometimes it's a little blurry in terms of what you need to chase versus not. But that's why we run these engagements to help the blue teams understand, okay, this is an evasive attack that maybe, hit under the radar a little bit versus, hey, this is a very noisy attack. And for some reason, one of the defensive controls didn't fire. So maybe there's a configuration issue, right? So lots of benefits in running these exercises, tremendously useful. And hey, they're a lot of fun.
Yeah, I think it's a great highlight when we talk about zero-day attacks. Again, this unknown threat, it's just going to come in as something that is attacking your environment, right? That's your event if you detect it, hopefully, right? And we have the famous quote of everybody has a plan until they get punched in the face, right? So I think the purple team engagement's a great opportunity to get that punch and then actually react to it, see how you're doing. And Alex and Elaine, you guys both highlighted muscle memory and having that practice in place, right? So those are great highlights when it comes to response, as far as making sure the company has a little bit of a well-oiled process around that. And ultimately, while you may not be able to predict what's out there, Elaine, you mentioned that, and Alex, if you have a good process that's well written and the company has gone through that, has matured that, you'll be able to handle what comes in, or at least have a first response to that quickly gets in front of some of these threats. Now, we did in a little bit earlier, kind of first part of the discussion, highlighted a little bit on MDR services. Elaine, you had mentioned how purple team engagements and then working through those to get feedback, and then having a continual feedback with either your SOC or who's responding. So we want to talk about MDR services for a sec here, and or even SOC services in general. I'll kick that over to Rich as far as when we look at responding to attacks that could be tied back to a zero-day vulnerability or something in your environment that's unknown. How can an effective MDR service help you with that? And in addition to that, how do you maybe incorporate that into your response plans and make sure that MDR service is working effectively for your company?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of ways, honestly. I think that, it depends on the size and scale of your organization and your own internal SOC team, as you just said. A lot of folks that may insource their own team members to do this today, they may not have time to do the research, look at the emerging threats, be able to look at all the threat intelligence reports, be very active in kind of what's out there and emerging today. So certainly that's where an MDR provider, can step in and kind of play some of that role. I think the other thing is, no one can be awake 24/7 themselves. So a lot of vendors step in not only to provide supplementary services, around the clock, but also provide just supplementary services they may not have today. Be able to do things like proactive threat hunting, be able to use things like, more investing in SOAR capabilities, which we've talked about a lot in the last, few here. Alex said one of the biggest banes of his existence is SOAR. Having good SOAR processes, programs, platforms, playbooks, written, mostly automated, hopefully, would be ideal in many a lot of MDR providers already have some of those in their repertoire that they can just go out and deploy for you as a part of this as well. I also think that tooling is important. We mentioned a couple of like the vendors early on today that are emerging in some of these different spaces and exposure management and even XDR and other things like that. Having dealt with the Microsoft ecosystem for a long time, having things like, looking at things like how some of their new automatic attack disruption works and looking for specific types of signal and events and chains of order and taking action on your behalf is something that we see as important. And again, your MDR service providers can help with, being able to take on and create some of those as well. Also, again, things like incident response, I think it's been talked out throughout all of this today. You're only as good as your incident response plan. And many times that may not mean that you've got enough people to cover the size and scale of the event that you're undergoing at that time. So again, having a trusted provider in your network is important there. And then two, one that often gets overlooked is security best practices. Some of these are just kind of things that get overlooked when we're all kind of in the firefight of day-to-day action. But having, an MDR provider that kind of knows and understands the platforms and systems and, not just as it applies to 0 days, but just in general, how to approach these things and patching best practices and how to manage some of these things are, important as well. So there's a lot of value that a lot of MDR providers bring to the table where, again, can be more supplementary in concept of how they integrate with you and your enterprise.
Yeah, and you mentioned integration there, Rich. So I think a good thing to highlight is, to your point, MDR services very effective in helping get some visibility, and they can bring best practices to the table. But it is not just a point and click kind of thing, right? Which we've highlighted in the discussion, right? So we're talking about an MDR service being effective. You can't just turn it on, right? You do need to have that integrated into your overall plans and continually improve that. And I think what Elaine highlighted and Alex on the purple team testing and continuous improvements, it's paramount to that. Kind of talk to Elaine a little bit about that in terms of how effective MDR programs can or can't be when it comes to bringing a provider in if your business is not integrated to that. I think that comes up a lot with clients when they're not kind of paying attention. They just want to turn the MDR service on. Hey, we have security, but that doesn't help you in these scenarios if you're not integrated to that.
Absolutely not. We see so often clients that just want the easy button, and it gets to be an easy button once you have everything tuned and once you get into a regular routine. But if you come in and say, hey, I signed up for a service, you didn't really sign up for anything. You're wasting your money if you aren't properly taking the time and energy and effort. There's always an upfront effort to get everything in place. But once it is, you can start working on building a really strong security program. These are valuable tools that you absolutely need, but it's a matter of getting them set up correctly and properly so it'll work for you.
Makes sense. Yeah, and so with that, I think we're going to wrap up today's webinar. If hopefully everybody saw here through this discussion, when you talk about 0-day attacks, the big piece is kind of an unknown threat coming into your environment, and there's not one way to prepare for that. It does highlight the need for a layered defense model. Thinking about the various areas of your stack, we actually went through kind of a traditional security domains here during the call today. Governance, identification of your threats, detection, responding, protection, and all of these areas. There's not a silver bullet, is hopefully what everybody picked up on the call through today's discussion. It's what I'm hearing from our SMEs. You do have to think about the robustness of your program, your ability to handle overall vulnerability management, but then down through your stack, looking at your tooling, how you handle doing offensive security, how you handle your protection tools and your response tools. All of the things that are in place for best practices help with that strategy, right? And I think that's what we're hearing highlighted from the SME panel today. And having a good layered defense model will help you ultimately protect from the unknown. And if you can't protect from it, then you will at least be able to respond to it in a way that's material, and your program will be able to then incorporate future learnings into addressing those moving forward. With that, we're going to come to a close. Really appreciate everybody who has attended the webinar. Thank you. Hopefully you found the insights from the SME panel here insightful. If there are any questions that we didn't get to addressing directly during the course of the conversation, we will follow up with you offline to make sure we address those for you. Thank you, and have a great day.